how's it going? I wanted to do a follow-up to my overview of the Big Book of Story Collection series. I talked about this in a video last week. Otto Penzler edited 15, at least as far as I've found, starting with the Big Book of Pulps back in 2007, all the way up to, I believe, the last one, the Big Book of Victorian Mysteries from 2021. And I have 5 of them here. I have another one on order, so I should have before too long. And I showed those off in a previous video. And thank you for those who watched and commented on that. And I thought I would start, as I promised in that video, talking in more detail about each volume, at least that I have in my possession. And the first one I'm going to talk about today is the Big Book of Adventure Stories. Now, this is again edited by Otto Penzler, with a fun introduction by Douglas Preston. Douglas Preston, pretty famous and popular adventure and thriller writer himself. Now, I talked in the previous video about how editor Otto Penzler, very experienced editor, very knowledgeable editor, collects and categorizes, breaks up the stories in these anthologies into various topics or subheadings. And such is the case in this one. Now, this Big Book of Adventure Stories with its great Rafael de Soto cover, ripped straight out of a pungent men's adventure magazine, it seems like, from the 50s. Anyway, it's pretty evocative picture and of painting, and it captures the vibe that Penzler is going for in this volume. Now, he collects some very famous and frequently anthologized stories in this, which I'll talk about in a moment, and also some that I had never come across before, and opened my eyes on some very cool stories and characters. Now, like I said, there is a foreword by Douglas Preston called Things Happen. And that is the very essence of this kind of adventure story, adventure fiction. Things happen. Now, that's one reason why I like this kind of story, whether it's, why I like genre fiction. Things tend to happen. Plot happens. Of course, characters are important. You got to have some interesting characters, memorable characters, but I'm not much for reading about navel gazing or sitting around and just, bemoaning your state in life full of angsty characters or whatever. Not really my thing. I like to read stories where things are happening to the characters and they are proactive in doing something to get out of a predicament or whatever. So that's a good way to describe most of the stories in here. We have the Big Book of Adventure Stories, kind of a cool dun dun dun, like a classic movie banner or tight credits coming up. And an even bigger one here. Okay, and I want to talk about some of the stories in more detail as we go through here. I'm going to put up hopefully the pages of the table of contents up here and go through some of these stories and categories as we go here. And then we have the foreword, of course. And I'll talk about a few of the stories. There's a lot in here that I haven't read. That's the way I like it. I like to have something to dip back into. Although I've neglected this volume too long, I need to get back into it. When I first got it, I read several stories, and some, of course, that are collected here I had read in other sources before. But some were new to me. Many are new to me, and I'm looking forward to digging back into this. There's a few I might have forgotten that I read, so forgive me if that happens. But I've got a list here of ones that I kind of want to talk about, and plenty others here that are well worth reading. I just haven't got to them yet. I'll put the table of contents list up here so you can look at it while I jibber jabber along here. There are, I believe, 46 short stories or some of them novelettes perhaps. This concludes with the complete novel Tarzan the Terrible, which is the 8th entry in the Edgar Rice Burroughs Tarzan series. It's particularly a good choice because it's one of the more fantastical Lost World entries in the Tarzan series. There were 24 books in that series. And number 8, Tarzan the Terrible, features a lost land with some warring tribes, which Tarzan frequently encounters in the Tarzan books. And I believe it's the land of Pal Udon. And they have a species of triceratops running around there. So got some dino action, got some typical action and intrigue as Tarzan is up to his neck in kind of war and conflict between these two rival kingdoms. It's a very fun book, and the whole thing caps off this collection, which again are all in this text-heavy double column style or format, so it can cram tons and tons of stories in. Some might say, well, why'd you put a whole novel in? And when you could have fit another, in that space, you could have put another dozen or 20 more stories. The thing is, you can't really have a collection of adventure fiction without Edgar Rice Burroughs, and he didn't really do short stories per se. So I guess you could do an excerpt out of one of his novels, but I think it's fitting that they put a novel of his here in this book to cap it off. And that in this format, you know, in my, up here, if you look at my Burroughs shelf, I have these lovely Ballantine Tarzan books editions. They're probably around 150 to 180 pages or more, depending on the edition or the story, the novel. But I believe here it's a little over 100, 105 pages of, you know, double column text to fit the whole story in. So pretty cool. But again, the Edgar Rice Burroughs was all about the adventure, so you have to include him in this kind of collection. Otherwise, it just would not fit. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't be complete. So let's talk about the way this book is organized. So we have a foreword by Douglas Preston, like I mentioned, an introduction by Otto Penzler, and then we start on page 3 in the section called Sword and Sorcery. Well, I guess Sword and Sorcery would be page 1, technically. Dun, dun, dun! We start with The Golden Snare by Farnham Bishop and Arthur Gilchrist Brodeur. And then we have, of course, you can't have an adventure collection also without famous pulp writer and just, you know, adventure short story and novelette genius, Robert E. Howard. We have The Devil in Iron. We have an example of Robert E. Howard's most famous character, Conan, right? It was originally, The Devil in Iron was originally published in the August 1934 issue of Weird Tales. Its first book publication was in Conan the Barbarian by Gnome Press in 1954. Okay, and so again, we're in the fantasy realm. We're continuing that. The Mighty Manslayer by Harold Lamb is next. And then The Seven Black Priests by Fritz Leiber. That is a Fafford and Grey Mouser story. So again, a lot of these are different subgenres, I guess, of adventure fiction. Sword and Sorcery is technically fantasy, but fantasy is nothing if not adventure. So again, the overall umbrella category is pretty huge. Next we have an interesting section here, Megalomania Rules, and we have The Master Magician by Loring Brent. Haven't read that one yet, don't know much about it. Then we come to one of the most anthologized adventure stories in history, and that is The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell. I don't believe Connell's famous for much else, but he's certainly famous for this one. And this has been remade into countless movies. I've talked about this story in more detail, I guess, in my 10 adventure books video that I did a while back. Fantastic story. Then we have The Man Who Would Be King by Rudyard Kipling and The Wings of Kali by Grant Stockbridge. Now let me talk a little bit about this. Grant Stockbridge is the house name for the series of pulp hero adventure stories featuring the Spider. The Spider had his own magazine. He was a knockoff of the Shadow, but a little more kill crazy than the Shadow, although the Shadow kills plenty of bad guys who are well deserving of it. The Spider goes a little bit beyond that. Anyway, this is kind of an origin story for Richard Wentworth, the man who would become the Spider. It talks about in the other novels where he, the Spider novels, where he has come the Spider, Master of Men. Richard Wentworth has studied some various skills and arts in the mysterious Orient, a la Batman, although he came out before Batman, I believe. And he has come upon those skills from some adventures in India. And this one is set in India, and it's called The Wings of Kali, and it's a pretty fun story. I have read this one, and it's pretty cool. So the writer credited with the first two Spider novels, writing the first two Spider novels under the house name Grant Stockbridge, is R.T.M. Scott, but predominantly from the third book on, Norvell Page is the one who is chiefly credited with writing most of these Spider adventures, and he also, therefore, most likely wrote this story, The Wings of Kali. Okay? And again, where I can and where I can find some art, I will try to show it to you. There are some cool bits of art, if a little infrequent. For example, the first story, The Golden Snare, has some. Then we get into one of my favorite sections of this book, and that's Man versus Nature. We have The White Silence by Jack London, Sredni Vashtar by Saki. I believe Saki's real name was H.H. Monroe, but he went by Saki. He wrote kind of tales with a little sting in the end, a little twist quite often. Then we have The Seed from the Sepulchre by Clark Ashton Smith. Now, Clark Ashton Smith might not be the kind of writer that you would associate readily with adventure fiction per se, although he, of course, did write some adventure stories, obviously. He wrote a lot of weird fantasy and cosmic horror stuff. And this has a definite flavor of cosmic horror, this story, The Seed from the Sepulchre. And this is about a couple of adventurers. I believe they're in the Amazon rainforest, and they come across a pretty scary situation. Let's just put it that way. Body horror out the wazoo in this one. Then we have another very, very famous much anthologized story, Linegan versus the Ants by Carl Stevenson. That and the story The Most Dangerous Game I surely encountered in high school, probably way before I ever came across this volume here, but I'm glad they're put in here. Those two stories are great and deserve to be seen and read more widely. Then we finished this Man versus Nature section with a great nasty little short story by H.G. Wells called The Sea Raiders, about a particular breed of man-eating octopus or squid or something. A very cool story. I read this back for Horror Mayhem, I believe, in another collection. It's a really cool story. Okay, next we have Island Paradise. So Island Adventure Stories. We have Hell K by Lester Dent, Hell Key. I was chastised in an early YouTube comment when I called the Doc Savage novel that looks like Fear K, C-A-Y. I pronounced it K instead of Key, and that commenter was 100% correct. It is pronounced Key. That's my mistake. So I'll get it right this time. Hell Key by Lester Dent. Now, Lester Dent, of course, was the chief writer of the Doc Savage adventures, and he was quite a good hard-boiled pulp detective writer as well, and adventure story writer. I need to read this one. That looks pretty cool. Then we have Off the Mangrove Coast, an early adventure story by Louis L'Amour. Yes, Louis L'Amour did write adventure stories for the pulps. He wrote for, boxing stories, fight stories. He wrote detective stories. In fact, his adventure stories are collected up here. I have them in the adventure volume 4 of the complete collected Louis L'Amour stories, the adventure stories he wrote about characters like Turk Maddock and Pongo Jim Mayo. This one, I don't recall the name of the hero of this. He narrates this story, unlike many of the other ones. And Off the Mangrove Coast is a very fun kind of Indiana Jonesy sort of adventure. Then we have The Golden Anaconda by Elmer Brown Mason. Now this I have read. This is a story featuring a character I had never heard of until I came across this volume. Not the first time that happened in this. And this is about a character named Wandering. That's his nickname. He's got a longer name in the story. But Wandering Smith. Now what Wandering Smith does, he's kind of a troubleshooter, a free agent who hires himself out to anyone who... He hires himself out to help anyone who wants to go after something unusual in strange places. And here they go after this so-called golden anaconda, and it's quite a cool adventure story. Shanghai Jim by Frank L. Packard, and The Python Pit by George F. Wartz. Now, I don't know about you, but if I hear a title called The Python Pit, I probably want to read that story. Next, we have Sand and Sun, so getting into some desert adventures. We have The Soul of a Turk by Ahmed Abdullah. Then Peace Waits at Marrakech by H. Bedford Jones. Now, H. Bedford Jones is pretty well known for writing a bunch of adventure stories, similar to Harold Lamb, who was included in an earlier section. Nor Idolatry, Blind the Eye by Gabriel Hunt. Again, these are some stories I haven't read yet. The Soul of a Regiment by Talbot Mundy, very famous adventure writer, wrote the Jim Grimm stories and Tros of Samothrace and was a big influence. Mundy was a big influence on Robert E. Howard. Suicide Patrol by George Surdez, and A Gentleman of Color by P.C. Wren. Now, I believe P.C. Wren is most famous for writing the story, the novel, The Four Feathers, which was set in India during the Raj, I believe. So this might be similar. I haven't read this one either. I really got to get back into this book. Then we have a section called Something Feels Funny. After King Kong Fell by Philip Jose Farmer. So I guess these are alternate history or fantasy-tinged adventure. Moonlight Sonata by Alexander Woolcott. Now, Alexander Woolcott was one of the famous Algonquin Circle or Algonquin members, New York writers that hung out together like Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley, etc. And it's a short story, but seems interesting. I haven't read that one yet either. And then we have Go West, Young Man. Of course, Westerns are definitely in the adventure mode, so they fit here. We have The Caballero's Way by O. Henry. I believe this is a Cisco Kid story, if I recall. Zorro Deals with Treason by Johnston McCulley. Now, I have read the very first Zorro novel years and years ago. I remember spending an idyllic several days in a kind of teenage summer on a chase lounge, in the backyard of my rural 21-acre farm that I grew up on in the Pacific Northwest, Southwest Washington. And I really enjoyed the hell out of that novel. I remember that. But I haven't read this story, I don't believe. I don't think it's an excerpt. I think it's an actual story. Then we have Hopalong's Hop by Clarence E. Mulford. Of course, that's a Hopalong Cassidy story. Then we have some science fiction. Future Shock, of course. A good chunk of science fiction, especially early science fiction, is adventure based. We have The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. And To Serve Man by Damon Knight. Of course, that was dramatized in The Twilight Zone very famously. And we have Armageddon 2419 AD by Philip Francis Nolan. That's one I haven't read, but the title sounds familiar. Then we get into some espionage stuff. I Spy, it's called. Woman in Love by Geoffrey Household. Geoffrey Household, very famous British thriller and adventure writer, or at least he was famous. I don't know if he's that famous now. I have one of his books over here somewhere, Dance of the Dwarfs, kind of adventure thriller set in Africa, which I should talk about and read at some point. McHenry and the Cauliflowers by Alistair MacLean. Now, Alistair MacLean, or MacLean, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Super famous, at least throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s. Adventure story writer, wrote The Guns of Navarone, many other strong adventure books, novels. Then Wheels Within Wheels by H.C. McNeil. That's a Bulldog Drummond story. He is also known as Sapper, the writer, and Bulldog Drummond is a kind of old school, some would say perhaps reactionary or borderline fascist kind of adventure hero, but a hero of several novels and made into several movies, etc. And this is just a fun little short story with him. I have read this one and it's quite good. A Question of Passports by Baroness Ortsey. I believe that's how you pronounce her name. She, of course, wrote about the Scarlet Pimpernel. Ortsey did, as well as a early detective character called the Old Man in the Corner, who would sit in the corner and solve mysteries. Then we have Intelligence by Raphael Sabatini. Now, Raphael Sabatini wrote, of course, Captain Blood and several other swashbuckling historical adventure novels. Then we have Yellow Peril. Now, of course, the dreaded Yellow Peril, Fu Manchu and, Mysterious Mr. Wong and all these kinds of, when America and Britain were fearing for the rising power of China, and Chinese supervillains were all the vogue there. We have The Copper Bowl by George Fielding Eliot, and we have The Hand of the Mandarin Quang by Sax Rohmer. Now, Sax Rohmer, of course, created Fu Manchu and wrote the series of novels about him. And this story doesn't have anything to do with Fu Manchu, but it is set in a Chinatown and, of course, is a Yellow Peril story. Those can be fun if you can read them in the sort of context, understanding the context and the time in which they were written. But, buyer beware, your mileage may vary. And then finally, we have the section In Darkest Africa. Now, of course, a lot of these adventure stories stem from a colonial period of time. And, of course, that's when dark Africa was dark and mysterious and a place that you could have any kind of adventure, including a lost world of dinosaurs, like in the concluding novel in this collection, Tarzan, this anthology, Tarzan the Terrible. But before we get to the novel, we have a story by John Buchan, The 39 Steps, who wrote the Richard Hannay adventures. We have The Green Wildebeest. The Green Wildebeest, according to Penzler's introduction, is the only short story about Richard Hannay that Buchan wrote. Then we have The Slave Brand of Slegman bin Ali by James Anson Buck. Sorry, I butchered that rather. We have Fire by L. Patrick Green. Now, Fire is a story I have read. I was really interested and intrigued by this series, and I talked about this in my 10 adventure book or adventure story video. The Major stories. The Major was this British guy who seemed like a Bertie Wooster foppish, I say what sort of fool, but was actually a top hand agent there in, I believe, South Africa, and he's assisted by his loyal pal Jim the Hottentot, and together they go through all sorts of adventures, and that's one here, and this one, Fire. It's a terrific story, introduced me to this character, and since then I've tracked down a collection I have over here. I showed it in that previous video, and apparently another publisher, another small press, has put out even more of these stories, because the writer, Australian L. Patrick Green, wrote a lot of stories about the Major. Then we have Hunter Quatermain's story by H. Rider Haggard. Of course, H. Rider Haggard, one of the premier adventure story novelists, wrote She and King Solomon's Mines and Alan Quatermain and People of the Mist, etc. I don't know if this is an excerpt or an actual short story that he wrote. I haven't read it yet here. We have Bosambo of Monrovia by Edgar Wallace, very famous at one time thriller writer. We have Black Cargo by Cornell Woolrich. Now, Cornell Woolrich is probably more well known for writing noir and pulp crime stories, like Rear Window was based off of one of his stories, the great movie Rear Window. I don't know much about Black Cargo. I'm going to check it out at some stage. And of course, we end with Tarzan the Terrible by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which takes up the last 100 or so pages of this volume. Now, let me go through and see if I can. Here's a picture of the Major, L. Patrick Green, and the story Fire. We have some cool pulpish magazine illustrations there. Let's see what else I can find for some illustrations. I know there are some more in here. Again, they're rather infrequent, but they are here. Here's one from Armageddon 2419, very tiny one, breaking up the text there. Zorro deals with treason. Dun, da, da, da. So it's nice to have some art. It'd be nice if there were a little bit more in the book, but you can't complain about the mass amounts of story you're getting. Here's Theodore. Did I skip this one somehow? Did I skip Snakehead? I don't remember skipping Snakehead. I guess this is one that I skipped in the somehow skipped over. Sorry about that. In the Sand and Sun section. This is by Theodore Roscoe, Snakehead. Don't want to leave any story out. This is in pieced weights at Morrow Key. A little bit of art there. The Master Magician, Loring Brent. Anyway, not a huge amount of art, but there is some scattered around throughout the volume. At the end of Suicide Patrol, we have a little bit there. Anyway, I can highly recommend this volume. Like I said, I haven't read all of it, but there is so much here left for me to explore, and that's the way I like it. I want to have some more to go back to. Like I mentioned in the previous video, the overview of these, I like to dip into some of these thick anthologies from time to time, read a couple stories here and a couple stories there. Well worth checking out and getting your hands on this. I'm sure there probably is a hardback version. I'm not sure, but the trade paperback is in, reasonable price and easy enough to come by. Definitely recommend picking up this one if you're into this kind of thing. So I will be back in the future to talk about another one of these collections. Thanks a bunch for watching. As always, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in a future video. Thanks a bunch. Take care.